Okay, we had hoped to have the book available, but we're going to have it available in about a month or two, so apologies for that. Right, I'm going to try and discipline myself because I do tend to talk a lot, and Connor's going to shut me up after 30 minutes. I have got about 150 PowerPoint slides, so we'll have to go through them fairly quickly. I haven't actually, I've got about 15, so don't worry. Right. I want to start really by putting the whole issue in the general context, which is that we're living in very polarised, very political times. I mean, I probably don't need to say this to this audience, but if you just look at what's been happening over the last 6 months or a year, you know, all the stuff around Windrush, around racism, all the stuff around the anti-Semitism, you know, issues in relation to the Labour Party and the Labour movement, and the Me Too stuff with all the accusations of revelations about sexual harassment and so on that have been coming out. I mean, very, very political times, and not surprisingly, as socialists, we intervene in these and we have things to say. The trans issue, the trans rights issue, is really a case in point. I don't think you can hardly fail to be on social media or open a whole range of newspapers, really, or switch the telly on without there's another programme or another article or something about trans rights. So what I want to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what the issue is, what the debate is, and then kind of go on to the kind of socialist response. And I'm looking forward to what people have got to say in the discussion afterwards. I got on the train this morning in Wakefield and I picked up a copy of the Wakefield Metro. And what do I find when I open it? But this. There's a picture of a man with his foot down a pothole, which is not what I want you to pay attention to, but the headline. Woman beds down as a man in hostel to expose sex risks. I don't know if you've followed this, but I don't know if this woman actually is a member of, it's called Man Friday, which is an organisation which goes around doing stunts like this. They've been to swimming pools and so on, and they go in and say, I am a man, so I want to have access to this space, this male space. And this is what this woman's done. I mean, it's... It completely, I mean, under the text, if you like, the subtext of this is clearly that a trans woman is a man. You know, that's the subtext of what they're saying, that trans women should not be considered to be women, they should be considered to be men. And therefore, what follows from that is shouldn't be allowed under any circumstances into, you know, what are designated as women's spaces. We can come back to this in a bit more detail, but this is just kind of one example. Yesterday, if you opened your Morning Star, you will have seen there was a letter signed by a whole range of people, one or two of whom I have to say, a bit shocked about, including the president of my own union. They all signed in personal capacity, but it was a letter. I don't know if you've read it. It's kind of worth reading it, because what it talks about is it poses as saying, look, we need to have a debate. We need to have a respectful debate, and of course that's fine. But what it then does is selectively pick up on a tiny number of unfortunate incidents that have happened between trans activists and particularly trans-critical feminists. And the letter's being used, really, to tar all of people like me and others who want to defend, really, the position of extending trans rights and extending them to self-definition, self-identification in terms of the Gender Recognition Act, as if we are all associated with this, you know, sort of horrible attacks on women simply for trying to raise an issue, raise some, some criticisms and so on. That is, you know, it's a pretty scurrilous letter, in my opinion, and I am surprised that there are some people on the left who've associated themselves with it. So, more of that, I guess, a bit later on. Let's just let me move on to. I hope you can see this. I'm probably going to stand in the way now. The transphobia and the gender recognition. What's going on? Well, I won't go into the whole history of it, but about a year or 18 months ago, there was a report from the Parliamentary Women and Equalities Committee, which had done a review of the situation for trans people in this country. You may not have noticed it, a lot of trans people didn't really notice it, but there was a trans action plan that the government produced in 2011, which was, supposed to kind of look at the issues that were, that trans people had around access to health, for example, education, unemployment, all the issues around mental health, self-harm and so on that are actually quite high levels amongst trans people. And that report was then, that there were a series of recommendations that came out of that report. One of those recommendations was about really trying to introduce a non-binary item in sort of official documentation. Because at the moment, non-binary is effectively completely ignored. The census question, and in fact the one that's going to come up in 21, simply has male-female. There's no option for any other. And really this is, the 21st century, this is a bit bizarre. That's caused a bit of a problem. But the thing that's caused the biggest problem has been the recommendation that the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which was, a very progressive piece of legislation in its time, has a number of anomalies. If you want, for example, to get a gender recognition certificate, you have to go through quite a lengthy, bureaucratic, medicalised process. You have to have a diagnosis of what is now termed gender dysphoria. Used to be called gender identity disorder. It's now gender dysphoria. And you have to kind of wave that about and send it in to a panel of people who you never meet, who also want to know that you are going to spend the rest of your life in the gender to which you aspire. And you have to kind of sign documents and so on to do that. You also have to have lived and show that you've lived in role. It's called not so much now, but it used to be called the real life test, which meant that you had to live in your role, sometimes even before you had any kind of medical support or assistance. And of course, that's a problem. Just doing that is a big problem for people, because it can, it means you've kind of almost certainly got to come out at work. You've got to come out to all sorts of people that you don't necessarily feel ready to come out to yet. How do you hold down the job? And then all sorts of issues like that. So it's a difficult and unfortunate process. The suggestion is, and this happens elsewhere, by the way, is that it be reduced to a much shorter process of self-declaration. So it's not as if you can kind of go and get a gender recognition certificate over the counter, but you can do it without having to have a medical diagnosis and without having to, do all the other kind of bureaucratic things, apart from make a formal legal declaration that you will live in this role, from now on, that's et cetera, your documents will comply to it. And so, now, I always say this to people, because not a lot of you may realise this, but if you want to, you can change your name tomorrow. You can take out, you can change all your documents, almost all your documents, if you want to, simply by, going to a commissioner of oaths and saying, this is what I want to do. Can I have a new passport? Can I have a blah, 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 blah. I did all that. I don't have a gender recognition certificate because I do not want, and my partner and I do not want to get divorced, because that's another issue with it. If you can't, a married person at the time I was applying couldn't get the certificate. You had to annul your marriage, which is quite oppressive, really, because it's a matter of choice. Really, it ought to be a matter of choice. Anyway, you can all change your data, your documents. What you can't do without the gender recognition certificate is get a new birth certificate. And that, of course, is also quite crucial, because there are still some situations where you may need a birth certificate. And, of course, it's always kind of there. So if somebody wanted to out you, they could do that by, accessing the records of your birth. So the gender, for many people, for many trans people, having a gender recognition certificate is an important thing. Actually, very few people have done it, by the way. There are not tens and tens of thousands of people who've done this. There's about 4,800 in the 14 years since 2004. 4,800. All right? judging by the way in which some of the critics have been arguing, you would think it's like tens of thousands of people doing this willy-nilly. You know, you wake up, oh, it's Thursday, think I'll change my gender, nip off down, get a certificate. Where's the nearest women's refuge I can invade? You know, I mean, it is. I know I'm being trite, but it is bizarre. It's a bizarre argument, it seems to me, against making the change. Okay, how long did that little lot take? Too long, probably. Yes, it did. Okay, so there is the government, and this is a very auspicious time to have this meeting, actually, because earlier this week there was an announcement from the government that the consultation, which was on the potential changes, on these possible changes to the Gender Recognition Act and to other things as well, was supposed to have started last autumn. And because of the furore that erupted, I mean, there were really appalling articles and attacks in, the usual suspects, the Mail and so on, but also the Sunday Times and various other of the right-wing newspapers. And some very dodgy TV programmes that came out as well, sort of questioning the whole nature of trans identity, really. The consultation over the Christmas period, the government decided they were not going to push ahead with that immediately. I mean, essentially because of the furore that had erupted, because they said it had become, quote, complex and divisive. Well, it has. I mean, it is. But, you know, really they should be taking a stand on this. They left it until this week, last week, to announce that, in fact, there will be a consultation and that they're seeking all sorts of inputs into that. They produced the new LGBT action plan, which looked to me as though, when I read it, it was mostly a list of all the wonderful things that, you know, the Tories had been doing in terms of funding and, you know, relationships and so on and so forth. But there you go. They will. I mean, a good thing in it was that they are planning to outlaw conversion therapy. I mean, that hopefully they will do it. Why they haven't done it up to now, I don't know. But of course, this applies also to trans people. It applies to both gays and trans people who may be hoodwinked into believing that they can somehow be converted into not being essentially what they are. And this is a horrible, long history rooted in the medicalisation of LGBT identities. Really, you know, it was still, you know, a medical issue. It was still an issue of mental health. Being gay was still an issue of mental health until 1993. It is still the case for trans people. You know, call it gender dysphoria, call it what you want. It's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, you know, as a kind of a syndrome, and it shouldn't be, in the opinion of very large numbers of trans people. So they are going to apparently outlaw gay and trans cures. That's good. And they're stating they intend to make the gender recognition certificate less bureaucratic and intrusive. That's great. What it's lacking a bit in detail, what they produced, and I have a worry, in the back of my head, that they may water down somehow the proposal that came out last year or in late 2016 to make that change about having the right to self-declare. Self-declaration, by the way, is the case in Ireland. I mean, Ireland I think I'll go and live in Ireland. Isn't it wonderful? I mean, you know, the referendum result, absolutely brilliant, fantastic. Same-sex marriage a few years ago. Their Gender Recognition Act that they passed in 2015 is actually much better than the British Gender Recognition Act. It actually includes self-declaration. And so far, I mean, it's only been going for 2.5 years or whatever, but so far, you know, there doesn't appear to be a deluge of people misusing it in order to invade, you know, women's spaces. By the way, the whole notion of women's spaces, or the legality of women's spaces, and the right to have those, is covered under the 2010 Equality Act. There are exceptions within that act that allow, for particular purposes, say, I mean, a women's refuge can, under certain circumstances, apply for an exemption where they think it might not be appropriate for a trans woman to be involved. Now, hardly any of them do it. And I have to say, most organisations, most women's organisations, most reproductive rights organisations, actually are trans-friendly. And there have been a number of statements that have come out in Ireland, in the United States, and to some extent in the UK as well, backing up, that sort of commitment to trans inclusivity. By the way, it also isn't an issue. This whole debate is not an issue in Scotland for some reason. I don't know whether transphobia just stops at Hadrian's Wall, but it's not an issue. They are pushing ahead with consultation and potential changes. So, again, Ireland, Scotland, anywhere but England, I guess, is the place to live. Right, the extent of the kind of transphobic media onslaught, really, it's been a shitstorm. Really, it is pretty awful, especially on social media. I try and keep out of it as much as I can because it very quickly degenerates into, hostility, name-calling, all really horrible stuff. It also clearly does raise all sorts of debates about the nature of gender, the relationship between sex and gender, and the whole issue about whether there is such a thing as gender identity, and if there is, what is it? There are those people, actually both on the far right and on the left, who are kind of denying that gender identity actually exists, and they talk about it really in terms of being a feeling. It's just a feeling rather than something kind of deep about your recognition of yourself as a person. So all those debates are happening around us, and we have things to say amongst them. I just wanted to run through. I have to do this quite quickly, but to give you an idea of the extent of transphobia, how there is so much still to fight against, in terms of resistance to transphobia. There's been a very large survey, it's a government survey, 108,000 actually self-selected responses, just recently come out, that looked at this wasn't just for trans, it's for LGBT plus people, it was the whole kind of gamut. Looked at health, education, safety of the workplace, and so on. And I picked a few things out of this just to illustrate the extent of the problem. That 59% of trans women, 56% of trans men had avoided expressing their gender identity out of fear, of attack, of hostility, of aggression, and so on. 3% had experienced sexual or physical violence in the last year. That's not forever, that's just within the last year. 21% of trans respondents had received unsatisfactory health care within the past year. And again, this is not just related to their trans identity, it's access, to all sorts of health issues, which are prejudiced by being recognised as trans or presenting as trans or as non-binary and so on. 80% said that access to gender identity clinics to begin to go through the process, if you like, of getting formal help had been difficult. 68% complained about long waiting lists. Those waiting lists, by the way, can be anything up to 2 or 3 years before your first appointment. And then it's just a question of a review before you then get into any kind of treatment cycle. 23% of LGBT people had experienced a negative or mixed response in the workplace for being LGBT or perceived to be LGBT. And the government has set aside a huge sum of money to address these problems. Here it is, £4.5 million. That will go a long way, not. Okay. I want to move on a bit. Does anybody know who Naomi Hershey is? A few nods? No? Okay. Naomi was the most recent trans person in this country to be murdered. Found stabbed to death in a hotel near Heathrow, I think about a month ago. There have been a couple of arrests since, but very, very commonly amongst trans people, particularly trans women who are attacked, very, very commonly, she's black. And there's a very high proportion of black and minority ethnic people who are, the victims of violent transphobia. Roxana Hernandez, anybody recognise that name? No? You were muttering. What was that? Yeah. Yes. Roxana died in the custody of the American immigration authorities, the ICE organisation. She was one of a number of trans women who tried to enter the United States, again a few weeks ago, who were all picked up at the border. She was locked in a freezing cold, it's called the icebox, freezing cold cell. She needed medication because she was HIV positive. By the way, across the world, something like 19% of all trans women are HIV positive. It's a very high-risk group because very often people are involved in, got no option but to be involved in sex work, and frequently unprotected sex work. Anyway, she after 5 days in the icebox, she died. She's one of the many victims, really. Anybody know Hande Kader? No. Ring any bells? No. Hande Kader is Turkish. Yes. She was one of the has been one of the organisers of Turkish Trans Pride, or attempting to organise Turkish Trans Pride, because Pride, the whole Pride got banned again, 3rd year running in Turkey this year. She was involved particularly in Trans Pride, and was kind of regularly arrested. She was found having been gang raped, murdered, and set on fire about a year or so ago. I looked last week to see if there'd been any arrests in the case. No arrests. That's one of the features of these kind of attacks, these kind of hate attacks and crimes, is that very often the police are reluctant to do anything, or if they do anything, do you know, for example, in some countries, including in some of the American states, you can put forward, Turkey's another one of these countries, you can put forward a defence that says, I was provoked into attacking this person or murdering them because they're gay or because they're trans. It's actually a defence still in Turkey. And one person recently had their sentence reduced from sort of 18 years to about 6 as a result of using that kind of defence. Right, I'll move on. This is Brandon Teena. Everybody probably knows Brandon Teena was a trans man who was outed by the police in Humboldt, Nebraska, quite a time ago now, back in the 90s, and was beaten to death by acquaintances as a result of that. There was the film, wasn't there? Boys Don't Cry, Yeah. So it's not just trans women, it's trans men as well. What's our tradition then in terms of the left and LGBT? Wasn't called that then, of course, but lesbian and gay liberation. Actually, we have a very good and long association with fighting for LGBT plus rights. Goes right back to the first wave of socialist organisations and agitation around getting better rights for LGBT people. If you go back to some of the key individuals, Edward Carpenter, for example, was active in the Independent Labour Party at the time, a socialist. Magnus Hirschfeld, a German, people will know the name perhaps, very important actually in the whole kind of history of transgender politics. Magnus Hirschfeld set up his own clinic in Berlin just after the First World War. And I think he was one of the first people to actually talk about transsexuals or transgender as distinct from, gay sexual orientation. He kind of began to disentangle the two, because of course they are distinct. Okay, I'm going to have to move on a bit quick, I think. Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Well, there you go. Lenin and the Bolsheviks took oppression and fighting oppression absolutely seriously, absolutely central to building a socialist movement to take on the capitalist state. Lenin talked about a revolution being the festival of the oppressed. All the oppressed suddenly become fantastically creative, and involved and so on. The Russian Revolution is a good example of that. Yeah, okay. 2 months after the 1917 revolution, the Bolshevik government repealed all the laws outlawing homosexuality. They then spent some time discussing what would replace that. And they came up in 1922. The new legal codes talked about sexual behaviour being perfectly lawful and okay as long as it didn't harm anyone else. It was kind of a human rights type approach, really, rather than a kind of the sort of horrible legalistic approach that had been under the Tsar and so on. So the new code, it was the second country in the world to decriminalise homosexuality. The first one was revolutionary France. I want to just quickly run through, again, a few notable names of folk. I can't spend much time on them, but I don't know if you can see properly, but that is Leslie Feinberg. I always recommend Leslie's book, Transgender Warriors, 1996 book, which I think is really, very, very good, because it's the first, really, that's written from a kind of Marxist perspective. She was a member of a Marxist organisation in America. Died not that long ago, 2015, sadly. And those were her last words. Hasten the revolution, remember me as a revolutionary communist. Others, Sylvia Rivera. If you haven't accessed Sylvia Rivera's fantastic speech on YouTube when she was told she couldn't speak at the 1973 Pride March, even though she had been involved from the very beginning in the Gay Liberation Front and had helped to organise the first Pride March in New York. The kind of safe gays at the time were wanting to marginalise trans people and trans people's demands, because they were moving towards a much more reformist perspective. If you're going to run for city council, or if you're going to ask for changes to bylaws and so on, you don't want this impediment of these kind of radical queers, and you don't want the trans people, kicking up a fuss, really. And there was, it was kind of that sort of marginalisation going on in the mid-70s, partly, I guess, as a result of the decline in working class struggle and the sort of social movements that erupted in the 1960s. Sylvia died in 2002 of lung cancer. I always say of lung cancer and poverty, actually. She ended up she was living on the streets part of the time. Marsha Johnson, Sylvia's co-worker, really, comrade. There's a film, there's a Netflix film of her life, which is worth seeing. Died in very mysterious circumstances in early 1990s. Potentially, it seems, thrown into the River Hudson after the New York Pride March. There is a history of resistance, trans resistance, which I guess is what we're getting onto in the meeting towards the end, isn't it? It goes back prior to Stonewall. This is just one example, the Cooper's Donuts riot, way back in 1959, where trans people fought back against being excluded from a social venue. I just love this. Sorry for the inconvenience, we're trying to change the world. Yes! Jean Compton's the cafeteria riot, that was a biggie, and very, very important, 1966. Again, it was people being socially excluded. And they used the tactics that they'd seen being used by workers and by emerging black rights organisations of picketing and so on, picketing the doors and, etc., etc. The 60s, Stonewall 1969 was the end of a period of, really kind of huge changes in the world. Great social movements against racism, against the Vietnam War, the beginnings of the emergence of the women's liberation movement at that time as well. And it had huge significance. First time people had actually marched down a street saying, we're gay, we're out, we're proud, sod what you say, we're going to organise. And the manifesto that emerged from that actually was about supporting all people in struggle. They had a kind of working relationship with the Black Panthers, for instance, and they gave funds to the Black Panthers. Sadly, that didn't last very long. In fact, I mean, the whole, that whole kind of radicalism didn't last very long. Yep, okay, sum up. Sylvia Rivera, I think, I love this quote. I was a radical, a revolutionist. I'm still a revolutionist. I'm glad I was in the Stonewall riot. I remember when someone threw a Molotov cocktail. I thought, my God, the revolution's here. The revolution is finally here. Yes. So it's great stuff. The struggle goes on. I mean, that's the point. We are now in a situation where there's a backlash, a kickback, which is linked to the desire by our ruling classes to drive through austerity, to drive through a situation in which our wages go down, the gains that we've made, equality gains and so on, are temporary equality gains. They're temporary gains. They're never permanent within capitalism. There are all sorts of wholesale attempts to roll back in various places reproductive rights, LGBT rights, and so on. And, I guess the bottom line here for us as socialists, as revolutionaries, is that unless you change the system that gives rise to that oppression in the first place, the system that exploits us and seeks to divide us through the various oppressions and make it harder for us to fight back against our exploitation, against the system of profit accumulation, unless we are able to change the whole nature and overturn that system, the gains that we make and which we fight hard for, quite rightly, are always contingent and temporary. You can never say, you can fight transphobia, whatever, homophobia within the system, and we should, and we do. But at the same time, you can't achieve LGBT plus or trans liberation within the system. That's the fundamental bottom line, I guess. And that's why, therefore that raises also questions about how do you do that? Well, I have to tell you, there are not many trans people, proportionally. We're about 1, maybe 2% of the population. Just ourselves, we can't bring about that sort of change. You have to fight for unity. You have to work with others in united fronts. And he's telling me to shut up. You have to work hard to build that kind of unity. We are all part of, we are not just trans people. That's not the sum of our identities. We are part of the working class. And it's as part of the working class in a united way that we have to fight back and transform society and go for the permanent change. And that means changing the nature of the system that exploits us in the first place. I will shut up. Thank you.
Hi, I'm an Australian. I'm also a revolutionary Marxist as well. Relatively new to the game, but really for the working class. And I think the only way to overthrow the system, to create a society where people can benefit from their own, from their labour and what they do, I think we're all going to have to unite. And I think it's really important that all of the oppressed, just like what Lenin sought to do, all of the oppressed can come together and fight the system. So thank you very much for talking about the trans struggle amongst that. I don't know very much about it, so that's why I wanted to come here. Thank you for speaking. I wanted to ask you a question about the dynamic between women's rights, gay rights, and trans rights, purely because I just don't really know enough. I apologise for my lack of knowledge in the area. I'd like to learn more. So could you please comment on that? Thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to come back on what Laura was saying at the end about the fact that this is basically down to the nature of the system. So what do socialists say about this? Well, I say that everyone should be free to be who they are, and I really don't understand why people have a problem with someone wanting to wear a dress, someone wearing shorts, although the shorts I can understand sometimes. What is the problem with people just being who they are? There's a thing in the system. It's to do with being divided by class, and in my opinion, everything else shakes out from that. Divided by race, divided by gender, whatever that may actually be. If we can nail that problem, then everything else shakes out from that. Now that sounds very, very simple, but as Laura said, this is easier to do as a group. We need to work together, we need to come together and to overcome the divisions that the ruling class put there to keep us apart. So if we can come together by sexuality, by these artificial divisions of nationality, of race, which has no scientific basis behind it whatsoever. And this is easier to do as a group, it's easier to do as an organised group. So I know that this is the first meeting, this is the first call to come and talk to somebody about joining the SWP that you'll hear over the course of the next 4 days. But think about joining the party. It's easier to work through these really quite complex and nuanced arguments when you can talk to somebody about it. So there are loads of members in the room, there are loads of new people in the room. Come and have a bigger, nuanced conversation on a one-to-one basis later in the day. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to say at the beginning, please keep contributions to 3 minutes. Yeah. And the next is the comrade at the front here.
First of all, I'd just like to congratulate you because I've chaired Laura before and you did really well.
Thank you.
And it's for wearing shorts. You keep your nose out. I love my shorts. I just think it's the same old shit, isn't it? You know, when I was a kid, I remember because I was brought up, my 2 aunties are black, and all my well-meaning liberal friends would say, you see, I'm not a racist, but, you know, the kids are going to suffer. They won't know if they're black or white, or, you know, it's the same stuff with that mixed heritage thing. You know, the liberals and the left with the arguments of trans. You know, gay men, when I grew up in the 80s, gay men, got nothing against gay men, but, you know, kids, everyone's going to want to be gay if we push it, you know, at schools and things. Some even argued, actually, some feminists even argued it was misogynist to be gay. What was her name, Julie? That hideous woman. Yeah, she said gay men are just an example of misogyny gone all the way or something. And they say about abortion, everyone's going to go and have an abortion because it's legal. You know, it's the same old shit. It really is. And it's just, don't hide behind being a liberal. You know, don't hide behind being a lefty. You're either with the oppressed or you're not. And it's quite an easy, simple, basic thing to think. One of the things that do amuse me for this, and I don't mean this in a flippant way, is just how many of my friends are really getting their head around it. It seems to be bringing people together. A lot of my hetero male friends are really trying because they really don't get, like you said, Claire, what the hell difference does it make what gender you want to be at the end of the day? In fact, if you want to be of any gender, etc. And it's really good because I'm going in the pub and a couple of them will come up to me and go, Dean, can I just have a quick word? I heard this word today, demisexual. And I'm like, yeah, what does it mean? And then when I tell them, they go, like, demisexual is a great example. In fact, it was a gay mate of mine. I said it's demisexual, and I tried to explain it the best I knew. Basically, it's, interaction is much more important at first, isn't it? I think around, you know, to have a feeling of sort of attraction to each other, you interact with people. And my friend just turned and said, oh, that's me and my missus. Like that kind of thing. And I said, well, you know, and he wasn't being flippant, he was just trying to get his head around this thing. And I think it's been a milestone on the trans stuff because it's really brought to the fore a lot of things. Anyway, I'm just going to do a plug. It's not just straight people, by the way. There's a lot of LGBT people that are really bigoted about trans people and really are quite horrible, and we've got to take that on board. Anyway, just quickly, on the 28th of July, we've got LGBT Pride in Waltham Forest. It's the first one we've done. We haven't got a march, unfortunately, we weren't in time to get one, but we have got a day. And one of the things that brought up was we wanted an ethos, and this is what we did. So going forward, in your own areas, we've made our Pride inclusive. This is our tagline: inclusive, diverse, political, anti-racist and fun. And the reason we said inclusive is because people brought up the issue of trans people. I wasn't saying they didn't want them, and my answer was tell them to fuck off if they don't want trans people. It didn't quite work, so we brought in the thing about inclusive, but I think there are 5 good things just to go forward with, and good luck, and come on the 28th.
Right here.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, you know, just because you're oppressed doesn't mean you unite with the oppressed. And I've encountered a huge amount of racism and sexism and misogyny, not just transphobia, on the gay scene, and you see it. You know, the manager of my local pub is a Tory, and he's come out with some fairly awful stuff, and I've had big rows about it. But, the fact is, though, it's not just, just if you're LGBT, it's also within people on the left. And a good example of this is right now the trade unions LGBT Congress is taking place at Congress House down the road. And there was a motion put in by my union that went through our general conference that was really good on self-declaration for trans people, but then it went to the national executive, and somebody who we think is a certain socialist, former Communist Party member, put in a paragraph at the end talking about protecting children, which is basically, the same thing sort of trans people are paedophiles that gay people used to get in the 80s. It's exactly the same thing. So there's been quite a row within the union about it. I don't know if they got it that paragraph off the pad in the end, but, that's people supposedly on the left coming out with this sort of stuff. And then you see, at the other end of it, you see somebody putting something on Facebook, and it's this long article about, why self-identification is wrong and why people are all male or female. F1's XX or XY chromosome, which means XX is female and XY is male. Actually, you get XXX and you get XYY, you get different sorts, and you get intersex people. And the argument really comes down to gender as a spectrum. I would say it's a spectrum. People have strong feelings one way or other, or none. But you should accept them for what they feel. At the end of the day, though, we shouldn't actually have to live on that spectrum the same way we shouldn't have to live on the colour spectrum or anything else. We're first of all human, we're secondly divided by class, and I'd like to live in a society where we're just not being human, not divided by class, and all the rest of it doesn't matter. And that's why we need a revolution.
Definitely agree with what you're saying at the start there about how many divisions there are on the LGBT community. How many divisions there are on the LGBT community, not just in terms of trans issues, but also race. It was really nice getting a history trip back there to Cooper's Donuts, which is something I wasn't even aware of. So anything before Compton Cafe, right? I'm not that familiar with, to be honest. But one person I did want to touch on that was mentioned was Magnus Hirschfeld. The fight for trans rights and identity can seem like quite a modern one. It's very easy to forget if you don't read your history that we've very much been here before, almost exactly 100 years ago. Magnus Hirschfeld was born in the late 1800s in Germany, did a fantastic amount of research into gender and sexuality, literally performed some of the first gender affirmation surgeries in the early 1900s. Really advanced stuff. Also founded societies, managed to get large political and social support within German society at the time. The air of sexual and gender liberation was very much in the air. To the extent that there was the biggest library in the world of writings on gender and sexuality, which coincidentally was burned down by a gang of youths directed by Nazis as they slowly came to power, and Magnus was basically pushed out of the country. One last thing I wanted to touch on was the non-binary option, because I do remember recently seeing that I would not be able to apply for a passport with that in it and just being enraged by that. As you mentioned, the proportion of trans people in this country is actually fantastically small, smaller than what a lot of people like to think it is. I wonder what the proportion of people in this country who would have wanted a non-binary option if they knew what it was would be. That's a question I'd love to hear input from on anyone else. Feel free to come and have a chat to me later if you see me. And
After this will be the comrade behind who the person is just speaking.
I just want to make 2 points. One is, I work for the Socialist Workers Party's industrial department, and it's very striking going to a lot of trade union conferences over the last year. There are arguments, but what's interesting is how many union conferences in the last 2 years have passed motions on transgender rights, there's a real debate, that are actually very good. I mean, USDOR, not the first union, the shop workers union tends to be seen on. You go to their policy that they passed last year, it's actually very good. Recognises self-identification, the PCS. Unite yesterday had a debate about you can see it on their website. It's a pretty good policy. Maybe not exactly what I'd write, but it and this is partly why it's so disappointing that some of the leaders of some of those unions signed the letter to the Morning Star, and I think that does raise questions about accountability as well. But there is a view sometimes that amongst sort of liberal progressive people that the real repository of reactionary ideas in society is the working class. Well, where working class people come together to organise collectively, in other words in the unions and the organised working class, it's interesting that again and again the debate is being won about defending transgender rights, and that influences what happens in society, building on all those traditions stemming back to the miners' strike and Pride and so on. Second point I just want to make is I think that Laura's right, you have to... We want unity in the working class, but it doesn't just spontaneously happen. And there are arguments. And I think one argument that we face, sometimes on conference floors and so on, unions as well, is the idea that there's somehow a conflict between expanding trans rights, especially trans women's rights, and women's rights in general. And the one point I want to make here is that part of the very structure of women's oppression in our society is about control over the body. That women don't have control. Think about the debates about abortion, about who decides what happens to your own body. Debates about the right of women to wear what they choose, including the way it intersects with Islamophobia, the right to wear the hijab or not. And actually, an argument that says, who decides what gender you are? Because if it's not yourself deciding your own agenda, that is a power given to someone else, a medical board, the state, whatever it is. And therefore, the fight for self-identification is actually about expanding the idea in society that we should control our own bodies, including our own identity. Far from being a threat to women's rights, I would say that actually expands the question of women and all of our rights to decide who our own identity is. In other words, it's a fight for increased human autonomy. That is an enormous leap forward in society, far from being in conflict with women's rights.
After this will be the comrade in the white shirt on the right-hand side.
Yes, ready to continue from the last speaker. See, Laura mentioned in passing sex and gender, and this has been one of the arguments from those opposed to trans rights, who have been opposed to saying that trans women are women, for example. And it's an argument which I think is mistaken, and I just want to touch on that because I think it's an important argument for us. First thing is, of course, human beings, in order for the human race to continue, there has to be, it's a dimorphic species. We're a dimorphic species. There has to be a male and a female in order to produce babies. But beyond that, I don't think anything counts whatsoever. And that's important because the argument is now being used that, in a sense, sex is destiny, or biology is destiny. That's the argument that comes from the people on the other side of this particular argument. And I think that's profoundly depressing and very reactionary, because what it leads you to say is that women can never be emancipated because biology is their destiny, and therefore, that's why the argument becomes, how do we protect this little space here or that space there in terms of the bigger picture? And I think we have to say that sex only becomes destiny under very specific social circumstances, the rise of class society in particular. I think that's important because it leads on to the point that Mark made at the end of his contribution, which is we are talking about how we gain more autonomy and more freedom. And I think that's the key argument we want to stress in this, that the whole question of saying sex is destiny leads you to saying it is impossible to have any emancipation of human beings, of women or trans people. And I think it's therefore very important that we understand where that particular argument is coming from so we know how to counter it.
After this will be the comrade team member at the front.
Yeah, I've got a question really, and this is, what's going on in England? I haven't lived in here for a while, but there seems to be a specific discussion going on here, which, as Laura says, isn't happening in Ireland, isn't happening in Scotland, isn't happening in mainland Europe, as far as I know, where all of a sudden toilets, bathrooms, access to safe housing and something has become an issue, with all sorts of suggestions being thrown around which are generally not based on any sort of experience and any sort of facts. And there seems to be some sort of hysteria, and not just around the left, but around the left as well, that suddenly trans women have become a threat to other women, in a discussion which isn't happening anywhere else. Of course, there is transphobia all over the place. There are arguments all over the place. But in a similar situation as we got last year, there was a sudden outcry around Muslim women in France wearing the bikini, where you could understand why it was happening in France in terms of a whole history of the French left with Islamophobia and things like that. And you could start to get your hand around why is this discussion happening in France and not there. I'm really at a loss to know what is it that's provoked this discussion in Britain at the moment. Why have suddenly people who really should know better taken a position and are using arguments which seem to be going away from any sort of factual experience towards accepting all sorts of right-wing scaremongering. I'm really at a loss to understand what's going on here.
After this will be the comrade at the front in the purple shirt.
Hi, thanks for that, Laura. That was fascinating as always. I just wanted to refer to the article in January's International Socialism Journal. It's right there on transgender rights. It referred at one point, I think based on your own research actually, Laura, regarding the origins of transphobia being in the Industrial Revolution. I think it was based on, I think it cited you. And basically it suggested that it was as a result of the proletariat being formed into the traditional family unit based on these kind of the ideal bourgeois family, and transphobia sort of originated against that idea of women having to be within the family unit, designed to sort of, I suppose, breed the next generation of the working class. So obviously quite a sexist concept. What I was wondering from that was if there were any kind of examples of transphobia, perhaps even homophobia, in sort of maybe feudal society, and therefore how much so transphobia and homophobia are capitalist constructs. Thank you.
After this will be the comrade in the red T-shirt at the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if you've got this idea that there are women's spaces that have to be defended, then you have to have a way of... Because a lot of trans people, we just pass as their gender of choice and are not, as it were, spotted, and good luck to them, you know. And if you're going to go against that, if you're going to say, oh, we have to have these sort of spaces that are women's spaces, then you have to start checking on people. And I wanted to relate an unpleasant experience I had a few years before I left my last job, which was somebody in my office where I worked decided that I had not been born female. Decided I had a deep voice and large hands and feet, and came in and started saying to me, come on, you know, own up, you were born a man, weren't you? And then, obviously, this is a kind of workplace bullying, but this person obviously then started talking to his friends about this, and there was kind of tittering and whispering and stuff, and this is really quite unpleasant stuff, and it made me think, you know, obviously I had to deal with this, is workplace bullying, I have to deal with it, but it made me think, what if I had been a trans woman? You know, how horrible would that have been? And why should anybody, trans or not, have to endure somebody who just takes it on themselves that they're going to police the sexual divide in this way, which is what you would have to have if you're going to start challenging people, well, you shouldn't be in this toilet or this changing room or whatever it is. It seems to me that in a society which oppresses women, right, there's a vested interest. If you're going to maintain a society, capitalism has to oppress women. And so the dividing line between men and women has to be tightly controlled and patrolled, because if you don't know which is which, you know, how are you going to oppress the women if you don't know which is which, you know? So to join in with that patrolling, to join in with saying, oh, this is a very important boundary and we have to defend it, seems, as the last speaker said, incredibly reactionary. OK, I'll stop there.
We've got time for maybe one more contribution, but nobody's indicated, so if you do want to speak, now's the time to say.
Hi. I have two minor points. So the firstly is that I'm a strong believer that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. Right? Words are not enough, but they definitely have meaning. And I was a tiny bit concerned by some of the words some people use. Like, for example, we don't care what gender you want to be and things like that. Like, the whole point of having solidarity, I believe, isn't that we ignore differences, that we pretend differences don't exist. I think it's that we celebrate differences. To have solidarity means we recognise we are all different and that we love each other for it, right? And I think that's an important, maybe it's just a word choice, but I think it's pretty important. My second point is that we have to be careful, considering we're socialists, right? We believe in class struggle, and I do as well. But sometimes there's a danger of becoming too class reductionist. Say not all things are directly related to class. Like, many oppressions are born from the like ruling class. They trickle down, the only thing that does, into the working class. But like, it's important to recognize that when there's like multiple different types of oppression, they intersect differently. So it's worth like just like considering that. Yeah.
Right, this will be our last speaker.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's true that I'd say rather than they trickle down from the ruling class, that they are created from the class system, and in that sense that the way in which people talk about the Industrial Revolution was really the agricultural revolution, that we talk, as Marxists talk about, the historic defeat for women, in the sense of the changes in the way that people produce things led to a society where people were hoarding the wealth, and it created a situation where where women started to be oppressed. But the Industrial Revolution nonetheless took things to a whole new level, and it wasn't just about the way that the working class were oppressed. It was also about the way in which the ruling class wanted to carry on their wealth, in which they wanted to transmit that the idea of the family unit in order for inheritance to happen and everything. So everything about the way that women are viewed, the way that trans people are viewed, the way that gay people are viewed. It's all about trying to protect the family in that sense, and anything that's a challenge to that becomes a problem, and at different moments then it's more of a problem. So in Britain today, right now, it's I think about the response to the Gender Recognition Act, and about the way in which the right-wing newspapers have said, right, let's get together and attack people because of this, and whether because there's been things going on and everything in terms of fighting for equal pay, that people have come together and taken on some of these ideas and everything. I just want to give a plug for the Socialist Review trans pamphlet as well. Come and pick them up for me at the end, a selection of articles, including by Laura, that have been put together for £3. Thanks.
I'm going to bring Laura back now to sum up for about 10 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. Really good points made. And, the discussion goes on, doesn't it? I mean, if there are other meetings in the series, the LGBT series, and, people should come along and make points there as well and join that discussion. And, of course, join the party as well, because it's in the party that we're concretely trying to develop a historical materialist approach to these arguments, so that we don't fall into the kind of traps that unfortunately some people on the left appear to be doing. I'll try and pick up on just some of the points. The comrade who said that we can become class, two class reductions. I mean, there is a danger of that, of course, but that's kind of not what we're saying. Class is fundamental to how we understand where oppression comes from. It's you can't understand the roots of oppression without understanding the nature of the class system in which it operates, and the social relations that derive from the exploitation, the process of exploitation that goes on. We are ripped off. Our labour is accumulated in the profits, and profits of a tiny minority of people, and how they continue to do that process means they have to try and create the kind of divisions, or encourage the kind of divisions that that exist, and potentially keep us divided, prevent us from the unity that can challenge the very nature of the system, the exploitative nature of the system that we all unfortunately live in. So it's not about reducing it to kind of class and economics, but it is seeing that in the context, seeing oppression within that context of class. It's part of the problem and the debate that's going on with alternative explanations of oppression, isn't it? Because many of them are rooted in some form of identity theory approach, intersectionality theory, privilege theory, queer theory, and so on. Now, I mean, we share with people who are attracted to those sorts of theories, which are, pretty hegemonic, to be honest, amongst feminists and amongst socialists, broadly, particularly younger people, I would say. We share the revulsion at the oppression that we face and we see around us. We want to work with people but we stand shoulder to shoulder. But then we actually do have to have those discussions with people and say, look, we want the biggest possible united collective resistance. The problem with a lot of identity theories is that they are actually founded on the divisions, the differences that we have, rather than the things that we have in common. And they tend to look for individualised solutions. Checking your privilege, for example. Things like that, which are problematic, really, from a historical materialist, a Marxist perspective. So we need to have those discussions in a fraternal way, I think, and try and convince people that actually, Marxism, historical materialism, the notions developed by Marx in terms of how we understand the system are, highly relevant to today's issues around oppression, because they can provide answers both in terms of the theoretical answers, but also guidance for how we should best fight those oppressions, it seems to me. A couple of specific things. The comrade who talked about being questioned at work, it's an appalling story, isn't it? But yes, that's kind of what happens. Even some well-meaning people may well start to question you if you're trans, which is intrusive and so on. But I'll tell you what, in terms of the bathroom bans, which are perhaps a bigger thing in America, because North Dakota, is it North Dakota? North Carolina passed did have a law that said that they were banning trans people from bathrooms. Who really was targeted by that? I'll tell you. Actually, it was a lot of cisgender women who didn't look feminine enough and found themselves being oiked out of toilets by security staff. So the idea that it was protecting the privacy of cisgender women is a nonsense. There's some really good stuff on the Tinterweb all about that, if you go and have a look for it. Right, I do think that I think one of the factors for why England, I think it was what Phil said, why England, it's not because there's such a well of reactionary folk here compared to anywhere else. I think it's at least got something to do with the level of class struggle at the moment, which is actually the lowest number of strikes since 1893 or whatever it was. Look at what was the biggest strike recently was the UCU strike in the universities. Brilliant. What was noticeable about that was that all of a sudden, but those people who got involved and got enthused by that strike also began to question not just why their pensions are being ripped off, but also why are universities governed in the way they are? Why are women paid less? Why are most casualised workers women? All those kind of equality issues began to be questioned and potentially organisationally resisted. The problem with a low level of struggle is that an issue like around anti-Semitism in the Labour Party or whatever it is, the whole trans issue, can begin to get a momentum, probably not the right word to use, but anyway, a political momentum, which it might not do if there was a much more widespread level of industrial struggles and other struggles going on, because we would be consumed by that and standing together and fighting in a united way, rather than, I don't know, navel gazing or coming out with really reactionary kind of reactionary ideas around these sorts of issues. A couple of other things. Biological sex, somebody mentioned. Yeah, most of the recent work on biological sex, surprise, surprise, shows us that it really isn't as binary as many people think it is. That in fact it's not just intersex conditions per se, but actually our cells have a variety in many cases of chromosomal chromosomal confusions and so on. So the notion that there is this kind of strict binary just is a no-no, really. The comrade who said any man can gain access now if they wanted to or at least attempt to go to a so-called women's only space. Yeah, you don't actually need a gender recognition certificate if you're a man to dress up. Perhaps impersonate a woman and seek to get into, I don't know, a women's toilet or something. You don't have to do that. You can do that now. It is perfectly feasible that somebody could do that. I think there are probably some people who have done that, a tiny minority of people. But the idea that that trans women do that because they want to go in and attack women or ogle women is a kind of, it's a scaremongering falsehood. It really is a scaremongering, a falsehood. It's simply not the case. That I don't know of a single case, by the way. I don't know a single case of a trans woman attacking women in a women's toilet. Not one. But there you go. That apparently is still enough to create problems. The comrade talked about control over one's body. It is a fantastic contradiction, isn't it? That some of the very same people who support a woman's right to choose don't allow that possibility, or don't want to allow that possibility for trans people to choose what to do with their bodies or how to present their bodies. It is outright reactionary, and it has nothing, in my view, nothing whatsoever to do with socialist liberation. Nothing at all. It's actually a really reactionary, position to adopt. The paedophile argument, yes, we've seen that again. Where did we see that 20 years ago? You look at some of this stuff, and people talk about some kind of malignant trans lobby that is out to force children. It's children who to make decisions about their lives which are irreversible. Now, again, factually incorrect, because that is not what happens. The most that will happen to somebody who is referred to or refers themselves to a gender identity clinic and is kind of under 16 or under 18 is that they might, after a whole long process of assessment, get puberty blockers, which would prevent their bodies from going through irreversible process. It's, by these accusations or these claims actually put those children in danger, because we know the rate of self-harm and suicidality amongst children, trans children, non-binary children, is way higher than the background levels. Some of those children denied that access, denied that help, will kill themselves. This is life and death issue. It's not an academic debate. It's a real live issue about oppression. The bottom line, I suppose, for us as socialists is that we do start from the question of oppression. That oppression for socialists, any oppressed group or any oppressed person deserves solidarity. That's our starting point, isn't it? So it seems to me it's an obvious answer when it comes to the question of transphobia and trans people. They deserve the solidarity of socialists, immediately and unconditionally. Not whether you've got a gender certificate, we can be, we'll give you some solidarity then, but actually, all trans people in that situation. Yeah, okay. I'm being told to shut up now, again. So I think yes, I'll finish on. I think I'll finish just on saying, look, if you agree with what we're saying, if you enjoyed the debate, there is a whole discussion to be had about how we apply, Marx's ideas and the notion of historical materialism to the kind of modern situation we find ourselves in relation to transgender and LGBT politics. We can go back to Engels, who talked about the influence of class. I need to finish
the meeting because we need to finish on time and it's over time.
So ultimately, it is about getting involved in the struggle in a united way, and get involved with us and talk about how we develop our politics around this as well. Thanks.